Okay, this is part two of our lecture on American foreign policy from imperialism through World War One. What we're going to cover today is primarily uh, World War One and American involvement therein. Although the United States, after 1898, was a nation that was gradually raising its profile on the international stage, and although its dramatic economic expansion had already made it the largest and most productive economy on the face of the earth, the U.S. remained, up through about the mid 19 teens, a relatively minor player in world politics, and it would take a major crisis of some sort to force the United States to move to the forefront of international affairs. And as we know from hindsight, that crisis was the First World War. Let me tell you a little bit about the background of the First World War. World War One began in Europe for a variety of reasons, competing economic interests, imperial rivalries between the major players concerned, but perhaps the major reason for the outbreak of the war was a series of defensive alliances between the major European military powers on the continent at that time. These alliances pitted most of the major powers in Europe into one of two camps. First, there was the Allied powers. These included Britain, France, Russia, and several of their lesser allies on one side. And then there were the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and their allies on the other side. Now, the ostensible goal of these alliances had been to make sure that war wouldn't break out, because if it did break out, it would be too costly for all sides concerned. In reality, however, the actual result of these alliances was to ensure that when the next war did occur, well, it was pretty much guaranteed to be a big one. The precipitating factor behind the beginning of World War One, the spark that touched off the explosion, if you will, was the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, also the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. He was killed in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. This led to a war between Serbia and Austria. Serbia was allied with Russia, and so very soon Russia got involved. Then Germany. Germany was allied with Austria-Hungary. And then France and Britain, and so on, until pretty much the whole continent was at war with one another. At first, the fighting in Europe involved swift troop movements and large clashes between huge concentrations of soldiers, very much in the old Napoleonic style of warfare that had been prevalent in the 19th century. Very soon, however, the war bogged down into a bloody stalemate along the so-called Western Front between France and Germany. And here a new form of warfare emerged, trench warfare, in which both sides dug elaborate systems of trenches and earthworks reinforced with massive emplacements of artillery and also machine gun nests, landmines, barbed wire, and so on. The result was a nightmare for men fighting on both sides of the conflict. Any attacking force could expect to take immense casualties. And so they pretty much had to live in their trenches in between offenses. And then when the time came to make an attack on the opposing side's trenches, they would do what was called going over the top. This is a picture here of some Scottish troops going over the top during World War One. That meant they would climb out of their trenches and they would rush pell-mell towards the opposing side's fortifications in an attempt to storm them and capture them quickly before they could be cut down by the enemy's artillery and machine gun fire and poison gas and all of the other firepower that they could throw at them. Not surprisingly, most of these assaults failed on both sides, and They led to enormous casualties for both the Central and the Allied powers. Part of the basic problem was that the tactics used by both armies during World War I had not caught up with the technology of war. By the 19 teens, most of the major European armies had introduced a number of new devastating weapon systems. These included the machine gun, also the tank, uh, the warplane, both fighter and bomber planes, as well as a number of other innovations, poison gas, dirigibles, such as the Zeppelins that were used by the Germans to bomb London, and many, many others. All of these weapon systems had the cumulative effect of making defense much more easy because attackers, particularly large bodies of infantrymen advancing across open space, were vulnerable to the response fire of these new and more violent and more deadly weapon systems, whereas the defenders could hide behind cover and direct that fire upon them. Because of the inherent danger of assault, most World War I troops ended up spending the vast majority of their time, as I mentioned before, in the trenches. Um, of course, these were very rudimentary fortifications. The living conditions were very, very poor. Sanitary uh, measures were almost non-existent. As a result, disease and infection spread like wildfire through the opposing armies. Um, for most of the early years of the war, from 1914 through 1916, British and French troops more or less held their own, but Germany's soldiers probably held a slight advantage until the U.S. eventually entered the war in 1917. As a matter of fact, by late 1916, it was already pretty clear that the Allies, particularly Britain, France, and Russia, they were going to need help against the Central Powers. Fortunately for them, help eventually came in the form of the U.S. military. Now, under President Wilson, the U.S. had initially wanted to remain neutral in the conflict, despite the fact that the United States had long-standing cultural and economic ties to the Allied nations, and most Americans clearly sympathized with the Allied cause over the Central Powers. U.S. banks, for example, had loaned about $2 billion to the Allies and only around $30 million to Germany. So most Americans clearly favor the Allies. But Wilson did not want to get involved in the war militarily, and he had gone to great lengths to prevent the United States from going to war. He'd even kept the U.S. out of the war after a German U-boat or submarine sank a British ocean liner called the Lusitania in May of 1915, killing 1,200 passengers, including 128 Americans. Um, so Wilson had gone to great lengths to prevent the United States from getting involved in the war. In the end, however, three major factors contributed to bringing the U.S. into the war on the side of the Allies. Um, the first is the Russian Revolution, which broke out in February of 1917. Russian revolutionaries, mostly from communist or Bolshevik factions within Russian politics, overthrew the Tsar, the traditional monarch of Russia. Now, in hindsight, we know that this led to the creation of a brutal communist dictatorship in Russia that really wasn't much of an improvement upon the regime that it had overthrown. But at the time that the revolution broke out, it looked like a somewhat democratic movement to rid that country of a hereditary tyrant. Ironically enough, this actually made it easier for Wilson and the United States to side with the Allies because now all three major Allied powers were supposedly democratic countries. Of course, they would learn differently in the future, but at least initially that's how it looked. The second major cause is the German policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which began in January of 1917. In that month, Germany announced that it would begin a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which basically meant that it would use its U-boat fleet to sink all shipping going to or from Allied ports, including American merchant and passenger ships. So Germany is putting the United States on notice. If you continue to have commerce with the Allies, we will sink your vessels. Germany justified this action out of military necessity. It said, we need to do this in order to starve Britain into submission. But America regarded it as a violation of their neutrality rights, their right to trade freely with anyone that they saw fit on the high seas. And the third and final factor that contributed to the outbreak of the war was something called the Zimmermann note or the Zimmermann telegram. This was a proposal, a secret diplomatic proposal sent via telegraph from Germany to Mexico. It happened in February of 1917. And in this proposal, Germany suggested that if the United States entered the war against Germany, Germany would want Mexico to invade the southwestern states of America and reclaim the land that the U.S. had taken from Mexico in the U.S.-Mexican War of 1846 through 48. What Germany is basically suggesting is that Mexico open up a second front for the United States to tie up American troops in its own territory so that it won't be able to devote its full resources or manpower to fighting and winning the war in Europe. And in exchange for this, Germany promised that once it had succeeded in mopping up the war in Europe, it would help Mexico regain the territory that it had lost from the United States. British intelligence agents intercepted the message, which, by the way, was ironically enough transmitted to Mexico via Western Union. It was initially in code, as you can see here. This is a copy of the original Zimmermann telegram. It was just a random series of numbers, but unbeknownst to the Germans, the Brits had broken their code, and so they were able to translate the message, and then they had it published in several major American newspapers. For Wilson and for the American public, the Zimmermann telegram plus the decision to reopen unrestricted submarine warfare was basically the last straw. The American Congress passed a declaration of war against Germany on April 4th, 1917. So the United States at that point had come into the war on the Allied side. Once American forces began arriving in Europe in large numbers, the United States' contribution to the war effort proved decisive. Overall, about 2 million fresh U.S. troops were trained, mobilized, and dispatched to Europe to fight the Central Powers. Other nations had fielded larger armies during the war, but by this time the warring powers of Europe had basically exhausted one another, and the introduction of so many fresh American troops decisively tipped the scales in favor of the Allies. The U.S. Navy also made major contributions by developing a convoy system involving the use of large numbers of U.S. warships, mainly destroyers, who would guard and protect supply ships going back and forth across the Atlantic to keep the Allied powers supplied with the guns and the ammunition and the food and other supplies necessary to carry on the war effort. And in so doing, they neutralized the German U-boat threat. The United States' participation in World War I temporarily elevated it to the status of a major world power. Not only did the U.S. play a decisive role in ending the military conflict in Western Europe, which was the first time that American troops had been engaged in direct combat on the continent. But thanks to the war, the United States also got involved in other theaters of international policy as well. Two in particular I'd like to highlight. One is the post-war relief effort. The U.S. took the lead in a massive relief effort occurring both in the latter stages of the conflict itself and especially after the end of hostilities. The effort was aimed at helping Europe rebuild and recover from the horrific human and material losses the continent had sustained during the fighting. In specific, U.S. relief organizations worked to provide food, clothing, and medical care to those who needed it, and offered American engineering expertise wherever it might be needed in the rebuilding process. The aid to Europe was almost completely organized by the American businessman and humanitarian Herbert Hoover, along with an army of American bureaucrats sent over for this purpose. Hoover got his start in public service by organizing food rationing for the Allies during the war. He once famously declared that food will win the war for the Allied cause. And to that end, he established special days to encourage the people not to eat particular food in order to save those resources for the soldiers. These included meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays and so on. Once the war was over, he turned his attention to the relief effort, where he gained international renown as an organizer, a leader, and a humanitarian. Another area where the United States found itself unintentionally involved was in Russia. In 1918, the Russian Revolution, which had already broken out the previous year in 1917, in 1918 the Russian Revolution turned in a surprisingly radical direction. A communist faction calling itself the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, came to power in Russia. Lenin took Russia out of the war, abandoning its erstwhile allies, Britain and France, and others in Western Europe. Those allies, especially Britain and France, were alarmed by this development. They were afraid of communism. They believed that the communist revolutionaries in Russia wanted to export their revolution to neighboring countries, and they weren't entirely wrong in that. And so they wanted to intervene on behalf of the anti-communist forces in Russia, and they pressured the United States to do the same. During the last year of the war and continuing up through about 1920, the U.S. and a number of other Allied powers, Britain, France, Italy, also Japan, and several others, sent tens of thousands of troops. The United States ultimately sent 13,000 troops to Russia. Now, the ostensible purpose of the expeditionary force to Russia was a rescue mission. They wanted to protect the so-called Czech Legion. The Czech Legion was a force of about 60,000 soldiers of Czech nationality who had joined the Allied cause. They'd fought all over in Europe, but there was about 60,000 of them who fought in Russia against the Central Powers. Now, the reason why they fought was they hoped to win Allied support for an independent homeland. And in fact, Czechoslovakia was founded shortly after the conclusion of the war in 1918. However, when the Russian Revolution broke out and when the Bolsheviks took Russia out of the war, the Czechs were an unwelcome presence in their midst. And for a while it was feared that they might all be captured, sent to concentration camps in Siberia, or executed. So the ostensible purpose was to go in and help get the Czechs out. In reality, however, once they got into Russia, American and other Allied forces militarily backed the anti-communist or white Russian faction against the communist or red Russian faction, and actually fought in a number of engagements against the communists therein, until eventually, by 1920, it became clear that the Russian Revolution was not going to be put down militarily, and they withdrew. um, in future years, this would become a major bone of contention between the United States and the Soviet Union. Uh, for decades thereafter, the Soviets remembered that the United States had tried to stop their revolution from happening, and they feared and distrusted the United States for that reason. America's new role in world affairs was no more evident than in its involvement in the negotiations in Paris in 1918 to discuss the terms of the treaty that would formally end World War I. Traditionally, negotiations of this sort were supposed to be handled by a senior American diplomat, perhaps the Secretary of State. But in a dramatic departure from custom, President Woodrow Wilson decided that he needed to be the one representing the United States in Paris. Now, as you may recall, Wilson was a progressive and also an idealist, and so he was inclined to view things in terms of stark absolutes, right and wrong, black and white, and so on. He believed that the immense suffering and bloodshed caused by the war, the millions of lives lost, the millions more young men injured and left permanently crippled by the war, all of that suffering and all of that bloodshed demanded a peace settlement that would preserve peace for generations to come. That was the only way to make the losses and the suffering of World War I meaningful. Wilson's main goals for the peace treaty were summed up in a series of proposals that he called the 14 points. Now, I'm not going to summarize each of the 14 points here, but essentially the 14 points contain three broad principles that you need to be familiar with. The first principle is the self-determination of nations. Self-determination of nations. Wilson believed that every nation in the world was sovereign, meaning it had the right to set up its own laws and its own system of government, which other nations were bound to respect. The second was free trade. All nations have the right, according to Wilson and the 14 points, all nations have the right to trade freely with every other nation in the world that wants to trade with them. Trade restrictions or exclusions, therefore, are inherently immoral and unjust. No one nation should prevent another nation from doing business, from doing commerce with its neighbors or with other nations throughout the world. This principle was particularly important to the Americans because this was a large part of the reason why they had entered the war in the first place, because Germany had violated their neutrality rights on the high seas through their policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. The third principle was open diplomacy. Wilson believed that diplomatic relations between nations should be free and open, that is, not secret and not coerced by any other power. And to that end, Wilson urged the creation of an international organization, the so-called League of Nations. The League of Nations. This was to be a body, an international body composed of representatives from all of the nations in the world, designed to help and aid nations in settling their differences peacefully and maintaining world peace without any nation feeling compelled to resort to war. The League of Nations Charter was also set up to help enforce the peace. It stipulated that if one member of the League of Nations was attacked without provocation, the other members were pledged to come to its aid, even militarily, if need be. Wilson's goals were indicative of a new internationalist approach that his administration had adopted. Wilson and his political supporters had basically rejected the old isolationist foreign policy. They now believed that America um, had to cooperate with other nations in order to preserve peace and in order to make the world, in one of Wilson's more memorable phrases, in order to make the world safe for democracy. And so the only way to do this was to maintain an active role in world politics and world um, affairs. Unfortunately for Wilson, his lofty goals and optimistic vision of establishing world peace through diplomacy were not shared by the other participants at the Paris Peace Conference, including his main allies, Britain and France. The basic problem between Wilson and his French and British counterparts was that they had a very different understanding of the war and of the purpose of the peace settlement. They believed that the war had been Germany's fault and that Germany had to be punished for starting the war. Since Britain and France had fought the longest and since they had endured the highest casualties, they believed that they should be compensated with a larger share of the spoils of war, including new territory taken from Germany. Wilson wanted a stable Germany. Wilson wanted Germany to recover quickly. Wilson thought that this would be in the best interests of the United States and of the world economy. Um, the Britain and France, by contrast, wanted a weak and defeated Germany. They wanted to make it so that Germany could never again threaten them. And they did not trust some highfalutin, idealistic, pie-in-the-sky organization like the League of Nations to accomplish this purpose. Moreover, both the British and the French leaders, including British Prime Minister David Lloyd George and the French Premier Clemenceau, considered Wilson's ideals and his 14 points proposals to be naive and foolhardy. Clemenceau expressed this attitude best when he once quipped at the peace conference. He said, "God gave man the 10 Commandments, and he broke every one. Wilson has given us the 14 points. We shall see." Despite Wilson's shortcomings as a negotiator and his personal clashes with his European counterparts at Paris, he did succeed in getting a lot of what he had originally wanted in the Treaty of Versailles. The final peace settlement worked out in Paris included a number of provisions aimed at placating or satisfying both sides. For example, France got Alsace and Lorraine back. These were two western parts of Germany that had actually been previously been French possessions, but France had lost them to Germany in a previous war. Well, now France got these territories back. Germany, however, was not forced to make any other major territorial concessions, and Germany was not dismembered, divided up into multiple smaller states, as some of the Allied powers had wanted. So France does get some territory back, but Germany is not otherwise carved up and annihilated. Germany was forced to pay huge monetary reparations to both Britain and France, which made it almost impossible for the German economy to recover, which of course led to problems later down the road. Germany was also forced to sign something called the War Guilt Clause. This was a part of the treaty in which Germany declared that it had been solely responsible for causing the war in the first place, which of course wasn't true, but Germany has, according to this treaty, has to accept responsibility in order to satisfy Britain and France. The German army was strictly limited in terms of its size and its weapon systems. For example, Germany was not allowed to have U-boats anymore, but the German army was not disbanded entirely. And finally, Wilson got the League of Nations, which had been one of his major objectives. Part of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles was that a League of Nations would be established, to which all of the major civilized powers in the world would be invited to become members. So basically, the Treaty of Versailles was a mixed bag for Wilson. He got some, but not all of what he wanted. He had also played a major role in crafting one of the biggest treaties of the 20th century. So, all in all, he should have been satisfied. He should have taken this as a win and been willing to call it a day. But he still faced one major obstacle before moving on from the Treaty of Versailles, and that was ratification. In order for the treaty to become law, it had to be ratified by the U.S. Senate. The problem for Wilson was that not all of the senators were well disposed either towards him or to the treaty that he had helped to write. He had also hurt his cause in the Senate in two ways. One, during the 1918 midterm elections, he had campaigned aggressively for Democratic senatorial candidates who were loyal to him, and consequently, many Republican senators had come to view Wilson as a bit of a partisan hack, somebody with whom they could not work with any degree of trust or um, mutual interest. Two, although he had brought a large delegation with him to Paris, none of the members of the American delegation had been Republicans. So he had basically frozen out the Republicans from participating in the negotiations over the treaty. As a general rule, the members of the U.S. Senate in 1918 broke down into three main groups with regard to their positions on the Treaty of Versailles. The first group was the so-called Democratic Loyalists. These were senators who would pretty much vote for whatever Wilson wanted, so they were on board with the Treaty of Versailles. The second group was the so-called irreconcilables. These were senators, including both Democrats and Republicans, who would not vote for the Treaty of Versailles under any circumstances. And then finally, the third group was the reservationists. The reservationists were senators who would be willing to vote for a treaty so long as there were certain changes that were made. And in particular, they were concerned about some of the provisions of the treaty relating to the League of Nations. One of the main leaders of the reservationists in the Senate was Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who also had a strong personal dislike for Wilson. Lodge and Wilson had been political rivals and enemies of one another going back years, even before Wilson's presidency. Lodge and the other reservationists indicated that they would be willing to sign on to the treaty. They'd be willing to approve the treaty, but only with certain modifications in the provisions relating to the League of Nations. In specific, they were worried about the provision that required that each member state would come to the aid of any member of the League of Nations that was attacked. They believed that this provision could potentially force the United States to enter into a war that did not concern it. And so they wanted the part of the treaty relating to the League of Nations modified to ensure that the United States would not be forced to enter a war if Congress was unwilling to declare a war. The problem for Wilson was that there were not enough Democratic loyalists in the Senate to ratify the treaty, which of course required two-thirds support before it would become law. Without support from any other group, he would not be able to get the Treaty of Versailles through the Senate. He could have probably got the treaty passed with the support of some reservationists, but he was unwilling to make the changes to the treaty that they asked for. So the question then is, why wouldn't Wilson compromise? Well, partially he wouldn't compromise because he was, as we've talked about before, a very stubborn, very self-righteous man. He believed that the opponents of the treaty were wrong and that he was right, and that was that. Also, because he'd already made major concessions to the Allies at Paris, and he didn't feel like he should have to make any more compromises. So instead of making a deal in the Senate, Wilson decided to go over the Senate's head. so to speak, and appealed directly to the people. In September of 1919, Wilson embarked on an enormous cross-country speaking tour designed to gin up public support for the Treaty of Versailles. He ended up making 37 speeches in 3 weeks, traveling 9,000 miles by rail, at the end of which he collapsed from exhaustion and had a stroke. He was brought back to Washington. The following month, he had another stroke that left him incapacitated. For a while, his wife Edith was essentially the acting president, carrying out his instructions from his bedside. Wilson's physical collapse also destroyed any political momentum that he had managed to build up for the treaty. And when Wilson refused one last time to accept a compromise proposal from the Senate's reservationists, the treaty was tabled and the U.S. Senate never actually ratified it. So, in conclusion, Wilson's failure to get the Treaty of Versailles ratified marked the disappointing conclusion to his presidency, and it also marked an end to the type of ambitious internationalist foreign policy that had characterized much of American foreign relations from the Spanish-American War through the First World War. After World War I, Americans became increasingly disillusioned with progressive Wilson-style internationalism, both because of the lives that had been lost during the war and also because of the lack of any meaningful achievement coming out of the war. Many conspiracy theories also began to proliferate in the years following World War I to the effect that the United States had somehow been manipulated into the war by foreign governments, Britain or France, by international financiers and bankers, by arms manufacturers, all of whom had somehow conspired to get the United States into the war for their own personal benefit. And in response to all of these forces, the American public turned inward. They demanded that their political leaders focus on problems at home rather than on troubles overseas. And during the 1920s, therefore, American presidents generally heeded the public's demand to scale back U.S. involvement in world affairs.